I signed the agreement in a forgotten cafe near the train station. Behind the counter mugs clattered. The coffee smelled over-roasted, and people pretended they knew where they were going. I didn't. All I had was a backpack, a crumpled paper from a failed job interview, and the number of a fixer who promised an easy job. Play the fiancé of a wealthy man for a family weekend. It sounded better than a cheap hostel and another rejection. When Adrian arrived, I could tell instantly he was used to being trusted. Tall, composed, with that distant politeness of someone who manages everything. I said little. He explained how important this small favor was for his parents. I agreed, rehearsing my backstory. Artist, glass, stained glass windows, a charity auction. My life was a thin layer of gold over cracks. Just don't let it peel off. The mansion stood above the river, old but immaculate, its windows glowing. Adrian's mother, fragile, tired but luminous, welcomed me as if I belonged. His father, stern, lined with fatigue, shook my hand. They seemed to need me more than I needed them, and that stunned me. My guest room smelled of lavender. An empty frame waited on the dresser, as though for my photo. A draft moved the curtain, revealing a narrow hallway beyond a half-open door. In old houses there are always extra passages. I noted it down. Dinner was silver spoons and cautious questions. I spoke about a non-existent studio, about glass cutting fingers if you drift off. Everyone nodded as though I were reciting a prayer. At night I couldn't sleep. The river whispered. The house creaked. I took off my pendant, the only thing left from the person I used to be, and slid it under the pillow. Movement flickered outside the door, a shadow, as if the house itself were checking on me. I whispered, "You're here briefly. Give them hope, take the money, disappear." But the silence in the hallway felt too deliberate, as though someone already knew everything I wasn't saying. Morning smelled of fresh bread and soft light. Clothes I hadn't chosen lay on the chair, a stone-gray dress, as if I had my own wardrobe here. At breakfast, gazes became ritual. Staff neutral, father weary, mother warm, Adrian attentive but guarded. They spoke of markets, philanthropy, a new art gallery. I played my artist role with growing confidence, even though inside there was only emptiness. By midday, Uncle Victor arrived. A man the newspapers wrote about, the kind who fused money and power. He studied me like a rare artifact. The word timely from his lips sounded like a verdict. I realized they hadn't merely believed our story. They had waited for it. And I was no accident. Later, wandering through the house, I found a narrow stairway, an unmarked study, a desk with folders. In one, my name and a grainy supermarket camera shot, me at a checkout with my backpack. They had checked me beforehand. They had expected me. The house felt like a chessboard where I was the pawn. Adrian appeared while I still held the folder. His expression was tired but unsurprised. Without words I understood. He was part of the game too, maybe even its architect. The documents vanished into a safe. The hallway closed, and we returned to the sunlit drawing room as if nothing had happened. Everything was quiet, but all the more frightening for it. That evening more guests arrived. Laughter and wine blurred the day's edges. On TV flashed news of Kirill, a man from my past, now wanted by police. The past tightened around me like a cold hand. If he was linked to them, they could use me against him, or worse. As night fell, footsteps in the hallway grew clearer. The house felt alive, listening. I lay still, knowing the play had only begun and there was no exit from this stage. Only the choice to act to the end or stop being a pawn. The house had become a map I memorized by touch. Each day revealed new blind spots, passages, second doors, locked rooms. I moved quietly, as if living inside someone else's dream. Corridors smelled of old wood and wax, air saturated with whispers you couldn't hear but could feel on your skin. Everything was too perfectly kept, like a set for a play. I learned the staff schedule, where cameras sat and where dark patches let you disappear. Those patches were mine. In them I could breathe. Adrian's gaze shifted. Not the first-day gaze of two actors in a charade, but as though I were a threat or an accomplice. Between us grew a silent bond. I knew he was hiding more than he said. He knew I was piecing the mosaic together. Sometimes I caught his expression, worn, regretful, like someone who'd accidentally let a wild thing inside and now couldn't let it go. Victor came daily, carrying documents, holding meetings behind closed doors with metallic overtones in their voices. Words floated out: funds, contracts, cover. My role was to be a screen. Only now the screen was starting to see. One afternoon I saw a photo on Victor's desk. Kirill and me, taken years ago in a parking lot. He'd been tied to them before I stepped inside the house. Ice water ran down my spine. I'd been a pawn long before I said yes. That evening on the terrace, the river moved like someone else's memory. I realized my fake artist's life could become a weapon. I began sketching in a notebook, hiding codes only I could read. Schlein a sign, each shadow a hint at escape. At night the house came alive. Footsteps grew rhythmic, shadows thicker. Locks clicked I hadn't seen by day. The mansion was preparing for something. I had to prepare sooner. I stopped thinking of myself as a guest. I was a scout now. I learned scents, memorized cracks, listened for shifts in air. For the first time in a long time I felt it. Fear wasn't an ending. Fear was fuel. By the third day the play began to crack. Eleanor watched me with long, weighted looks as though she wanted to warn me but couldn't. Constantine withdrew from dinners, while Victor claimed more space, issuing orders like the true master. I noticed Adrian slipping out at night. His footsteps down a side staircase led to the closed basement. By day he was composed, but shadows hung under his eyes. Those shadows held something heavier than exhaustion. Kirill surfaced again in the news. The same photo from Victor's folder, but now captioned, "Wanted." The past coiled tighter, a cold hand on my neck. If Kirill and Victor were linked, the family could wield me as leverage, or discard me. Inside the house a new choreography formed. Staff avoided me. Guests whispered. The legend crumbled like scenery. And I was an actress left on a bare stage. I kept collecting signs. I found an old blueprint of the mansion with service passages. In the basement a mark shaped like a cross stood out. I decided to check it at night. That night I wore a plain dress and descended the side staircase. Air turned damp and metallic. Below, a weak light glowed. Voices, Victor and Adrian, spoke of shipments, of ensuring she learned nothing. I knew they meant me. I hid behind a column, but my breathing sounded too loud. Victor spoke of a deal, of a proof of loyalty Adrian had to provide. The words remove and risk rang clear. My heart beat the ribs like a trapped bird. I climbed back up without feeling my legs. In my room I sat on the floor, head in hands. The house wasn't just foreign now, it was a trap. Adrian, once the employer, was either captive too or hunter. I didn't know which. I stared at my notebook sketches. Lines turned into a map. The map into a plan. I knew my time was running out. I had to find an exit before the fractures closed. By morning the house had sharpened into outlines. Thresholds that hummed when crossed, doors that remembered hands. I moved like a shadow inside a larger one, letting routine cover me. The staff's footsteps formed a clock. Victor's arrivals, a storm front. Adrian, a variable. Sometimes present as gravity, sometimes absent as a breath drawn and held. I began testing the service passages in daylight under legitimate errands. Fresh towels, a mislaid book, a glass returned to the pantry. Each errand concealed a line in my growing map. Where the cameras faced, where they blinked, where they were blind. I learned the telltale buzz in the wainscoting that meant power ran behind the panel, the slight warmth under a stair that meant a conduit, the way a rug had been pulled and replaced so many times the nap ran two ways. The house spoke. I listened. The mark like a cross on the basement plan resolved into a metal cabinet bolted to a structural pillar. Its paint looked newer than the beam it clung to. I couldn't force it without noise, so I watched instead. At noon a courier came with a soft-sided case. Victor signed for it without flourish, as though receiving flowers. He carried it downstairs himself. That alone told me what the case was not. Adrian moved around me like someone trying not to spook a bird. His silence became a kind of confession. He was missing at jagged intervals, then reappearing with the same gaze that held too much calculation to be called care and too much care to be called calculation. Between us, truth calcified into a stalemate. The ledger arrived disguised as a charity brochure. It was slipped under my door while I was in the bath. Glossy cover, beaming children, a mission statement. Inside, the pages had been hollowed to cradle a thin notebook covered in gray cloth. No inscription. No name. Only narrow columns of figures written with an engineer's restraint. Dates, initials, amounts, arrows. A meticulous, bloodless heartbeat. I did not need a guide to know what I was holding. The skeleton of the house's money. The cross on the blueprint appeared again, in shorthand. A second symbol trailed it. A circle cleaved by a line. I had seen that mark nowhere else. I moved the ledger to the false bottom of my suitcase, then copied 3 pages into my sketchbook as if I were drawing stained glass fragments. Each numeral became a lead line. Each arrow a seam. If anyone glanced at the sketches, they'd find geometry. If I looked, I saw a way through. Eleanor hovered at the margins like a frail moon. Her kindness had a different weight now, like a ribbon pulled tight enough to leave a mark. She placed a hand on my arm in passing, a gesture so light it could have been an accident. Stayed with me all morning. Later I found a key on my nightstand, small and old, wrapped in tissue. No note. Brass worn smooth by a patient thumb. I tested it against obvious locks and failed. Not for doors then. For something smaller. I held it to the ledger's back cover. The cloth yielded, a secret seam opened, and a slot blinked metal, an embedded drive no larger than a fingernail. The key fit. The drive released with a breath of static. Somewhere upstairs a radio clicked, then cut. The house took a breath with it. I replaced everything in reverse, laid the charity brochure back as bait, and walked to the window. The river was gray as unpolished steel. In the afternoon, Constantine collapsed during a call. The house surged, then constricted. An ambulance bled its siren into the driveway. White coats became the new choreography. Victor took command with polished urgency, shepherding people into useful panic. In the turbulence, the service hallways went briefly unguarded. I used the window. Downstairs, the cabinet's padlock wore a twin to my brass key. It opened with a reluctant click. Inside lay a pelican case labeled with a cleaved circle. Beneath it, a folder stamped with customs forms and a name not the house's but close enough to be a shadow. I didn't have time to read deeply. I took photos with a phone I kept powered down and cold, a ghost light only when needed. The images glowed, crisp and obscene. When the siren faded and silence returned, it came back altered. We were past some edge. In my room I slid the microdrive into the lining of my dress and stitched the seam closed with thread from the travel kit. My hands shook, then steadied. The river pressed on, indifferent. That night, someone turned my pendant on the nightstand so the clasp faced the door. A small correction, too intimate to be random. It meant 2 things. My room had been entered, and the visitor wanted me to know. I fell asleep counting fractures, the ledger's columns walking like narrow soldiers across the back of my eyes. Somewhere in the house, a low generator throbbed. In my dream the river split around an island shaped like a key. Morning wore the hush of a church where the candles have just been snuffed. The staff spoke in smaller syllables, their steps padded with felt. A doctor's car sat in the gravel like an accusation. Constantine breathed. That much we were told. The rest floated above us as if tied to a string no one dared pull. I built my plan like a bridge, measure by measure. Gather proof, cache it twice, map a route with redundancies, wait for a distraction large enough to swallow my exit. The drive in my dress was one limb. The photographs were another. The third would be a live witness, the kind of evidence that breathes and therefore cannot be misfiled. That meant Adrian, or, if the world turned cruel in the precise way I expected, me. Victor adjusted his orbits, speeding up. He made calls from rooms with soft carpets and hard art. He smiled more, which meant less. His presence blew papers into neat stacks. He was a man turning a ship by moving teacups. I avoided him as you avoid a toxin you cannot afford to absorb. Eleanor drifted, eyes soft but focused, a woman who had taught herself to see through lace. She set a tray in my room while I stood at the window and did not startle when I turned. On the napkin lay a single sentence in delicate handwriting. Tonight. Conservatory. She had written quickly, the tail of the Y a little frantic, as if the pen had caught. The note was gone when I looked twice, as if kindness had to be consumable to survive here. I spent the afternoon staging a mess where none existed. One set of sketches left on the desk, too pretty to be suspicious. A second set sealed in plastic and taped to the underside of the cistern lid in the guest bath down the hall, the only place I'd seen locked from the inside by an old-fashioned turn latch. The photos lived inside the heel of my shoe where the leather lifted and kissed back into place. The microdrive stayed stitched against my ribs like a second pulse. At dusk the conservatory became a glass throat swallowing the last of the light. The plants exhaled green, damp air. I arrived early and stood among leaves that had never known weather. Eleanor appeared as if grown from the floor, her hand on the back of a wicker chair for balance she did not quite need. She said nothing. She did not have to. She opened her palm to show an identical brass key, then closed it and placed the hand over mine. Warmth traveled up my arm like a quiet alarm. We stood that way for a slow count of 10 before a reflection on the glass moved wrong. Not a plant, not wind. The door at the far end clicked very softly. I tasted metal on my tongue, the house's other sound. I left first, not running, not lingering, just a person who had remembered a chore. In the hallway, the air changed temperature, a draft that smelled faintly of cologne I associated with Victor's suits. I turned into the service corridor and let the dark accept me. Steps followed, not hurried, not casual. Measured. I counted 3 between each landing. A hunter keeping himself honest. At the bend where the corridor narrowed, I slipped through a linen closet and into the shaft behind it. My shoulder brushed a rib of wood that remembered rope. The shaft led to the laundry. From there, the side stairs to the basement. I moved the way you move when your body belongs to a task and your mind is a metronome. Down, left, wait. Down, right, breathe. The cabinet waited, locked again. The key worked like a word I barely believed. The pelican case still sat inside, heavier than expectation. I slid the latches and lifted the lid enough to see gray foam cut for devices. Not guns, not cash. Drives. Stacks of them, labeled in that same restrained hand. The ledger's pulse had organs. Footsteps above. Was. 2 more. I closed the case and locked the cabinet, the key catching for a heartbeat that boomed in my wrist. I tucked the key under my tongue as if it were a sacrament and slipped back toward the stairs, intending to rise into the kitchen light like a woman looking for a glass of water. Adrian waited on the middle landing. No surprise in his posture, only a fatigue that went past bone into whatever carried a name. For a fraction I saw my own outline in his eyes. Not prey and not partner, but someone in the same weather without an umbrella. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze flicked to my shoulder, to the line of thread I had sewn. A decision moved across his face like shade over water. He stepped aside, leaving just enough space for one person to pass. I walked by him with my ribs burning around the secret they protected. His sleeve brushed my arm, an almost accidental warmth. Behind us, the house exhaled, a vent cycling or a relief too quiet to name. In my room, the pendant lay again with its clasp toward the door. No one owned small accidents here. I left it as it was and lay down on the coverlet without undressing, watching the ceiling's plaster tide shift with the night. The plan had a spine now. It would require a spectacle, the kind of gilded noise this family excelled at. People like Victor understood only social weather. Tomorrow a donor luncheon would bloom like a bruise across the calendar. I would choose its peak for my departure, step through the richest hour like a thread through velvet, draw no snags, leave only a clean slit. And if the fabric bled afterward, it would do so without me. Morning was all performance. The donor luncheon cast its net across the mansion. White tents rising like sails on the lawn, staff in synchronized movement, trays of champagne rehearsing their sparkle. Victor walked the grounds with the crisp impatience of a ringmaster checking the cages. Adrian vanished and reappeared in loops, his phone a lit fuse in his hand. I dressed like a version of the artist I had invented. Muted green silk, hair pinned in a way that suggested careless mastery. The microdrive stayed sewn against my ribs, the photos under the cistern lid, the ledger in the false suitcase bottom. 3 proofs, 3 exits. I kept repeating the inventory like prayer beads. At noon the house transformed into a hive. Cars lined the driveway, their doors opening like mechanical flowers. Voices rose and fell, the vocabulary of wealth and causes blending into a bright wash. I slipped among them, smiling, offering nods, sketching invisible outlines of each face for memory. Inside the conservatory, the plants masked the house's smell of wax and secrecy. Eleanor drifted near me, her eyes holding something unsaid. Her hand brushed mine. She whispered without sound, lips shaping a single word, tonight. It was both a promise and a warning. I felt the fault lines of the mansion shifting under the weight of so many outsiders. Security cameras turned to cover entry points. Staff rerouted to new posts. The service hallways went blind in places. The blind spots bloomed like black petals. My plan hinged on timing. Slip out through the laundry shaft during the dessert course, cross the lower corridor to the river door, take the skiff I'd seen tied to the pilings. The drive would go to a journalist whose address I had memorized. The photos and ledger would go to a second contact. 2 deliveries by mail drops. A third the witness, Adrian, if he chose. But during the reception, Victor announced a surprise. "Our family is proud to support a new artist," he said, and motioned for me. My invented biography had become an exhibit. Staff wheeled out a blank canvas on an easel, as though I might conjure a masterpiece in real time. Applause like glass beads rattled around me. I stepped forward, brush in hand, heart a drum in my ribs. There was no escape yet. There was only forward motion. I painted shapes that were not flowers or faces but the map of the house disguised as abstraction. Lines for corridors, arcs for staircases, a slash for the river door. My signature at the bottom a cipher. If anyone looked closely enough later, they would see not a painting but an exit plan. Adrian watched from the edge of the crowd, expression unreadable. Victor clapped at the finished canvas, oblivious. Eleanor's knuckles whitened on her glass. When the luncheon dissolved into smaller knots of conversation, I slipped back into the service corridor. My dress snagged on a nail, leaving a whisper of silk behind. I crouched at the laundry shaft entrance, waiting for a clear interval. Above, the music swelled. Below, water moved against stone. But a shadow blocked the far end of the hall. Not Adrian. Broader. Will. A staff member. Or someone placed to stop exactly this move. My pulse slid into my palms. I backed into the closet, pressing against the wood, counting breaths. The shadow did not move. It waited. The luncheon's clatter became a curtain falling. Time slowed to an ache. My plan was no longer a bridge. It was a wire, and I was walking it barefoot. Evening dropped like a stage curtain. Guests left in waves, their goodbyes trailing perfume and pledges. The mansion exhaled, the hive returning to its queen cells. Somewhere a door shut with a finality that felt rehearsed. I remained in the conservatory, pretending to tidy brushes. In the glass's reflection, I watched the hallways empty. Victor's car headlights cut across the lawn like blades. Adrian still hadn't come to me. Eleanor sat on a bench, a pale shape among the plants, then disappeared into the dark wing without looking back. At 9, I moved toward the laundry shaft again. The shadow from earlier had gone. The hallway felt hollow, stripped of its usual whispers, as if the house were holding its breath. I descended, each step a measured tremor. The key in my mouth tasted like pennies. In the basement, the cabinet stood open. The pelican case was gone. Only a single envelope lay inside, sealed in black wax with a cleaved circle. My name was written across it in that same restrained hand. Inside the envelope, a photograph. Me at the easel during the luncheon, brush lifted, my plan visible to anyone who knew how to read it. Below it, one line. There are no blind spots. The basement lights flickered. Somewhere above, a door clicked shut. I turned, pressing my back to the cold pillar. Footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate. Adrian emerged from the shadow, coat unbuttoned, face pale. He didn't speak. His eyes moved to the envelope in my hands, then to my ribs where the drive lay. He extended a hand, not to grab, but to offer. In his palm lay a new key, silver this time. I took it without words. His expression held both surrender and defiance, a man choosing which kind of betrayal to commit. The house hummed around us, a low electric animal. We moved together through the lower corridor toward the river door. The silver key fit the lock like a secret rehearsed. The door opened onto night air, damp and river sweet. The skiff rocked below, tied to its piling. Behind us, the mansion's windows burned like eyes. I stepped down onto the dock, clutching the drive and the ledger hidden in my dress. Adrian hesitated on the threshold, the decision visible in his shoulders. Whether to follow, whether to stay. A shout rose inside the house. Victor's voice, sharp, commanding. Then another, lower, closer. The glass of the conservatory shattered like a signal flare. Floodlights carved the lawn. The quiet exit was over. Now everything was noise. I untied the skiff and pushed off, river current catching it like a breath. Adrian jumped down at the last second, landing hard, rocking the boat. We didn't speak. The mansion receded, fractured by light and distance, the glass break echoing against the water. Somewhere on the opposite bank, a path waited. Whether it led to safety, to exposure, or to another trap, I didn't know. But at least now we were moving. The river carried us like a secret no one wanted to hold. Cold spray salted my face, the skiff knocking softly against its own shadow. Behind us, the mansion shrank into a smear of light, its floodlamps clawing at the night but failing to reach us. Adrian rode without looking back, his shoulders moving like a metronome. I held the microdrive under my coat, its edges biting into my palm like a promise. We aimed for a low bank hidden under willows. The current tried to spin us, but Adrian knew the water as if he'd rehearsed this escape for years. My body shook, not from cold but from the adrenaline of leaving a place that had rewritten my blood. On shore, we dragged the skiff into reeds. The earth smelled of mud and iron. Above, an old service road curled away toward the train tracks. We moved quickly, keeping our heads down. The night was no longer just cover. It was a living ally. Adrian finally spoke, his voice dry. They won't let it go. No apology, no explanation, just a line drawn under a sum. He nodded. I didn't need more words. We had one goal: get the proof out before the family could smother it. We walked until dawn bruised the sky. In an abandoned shed near the tracks, I took out the microdrive and slid it into a prepaid phone, uploading the files to 2 hidden addresses. Bars of progress crawled upward, each percent a pulse. When it finished, I crushed the phone under a brick. For the first time in days, I exhaled without a tremor. Adrian leaned against the doorframe, eyes closed. He wasn't free yet, but something inside him had unclenched. We had crossed the river. Now we had to cross the rest of our lives. We split up at the station. Adrian bought a ticket south under another name. I stayed behind with a backpack that suddenly felt heavier than when I arrived at the mansion. Trains clattered past like giant clocks. Every announcement was a countdown. I sent the second packet, photos and notes, to a journalist whose address I had memorized. In my message I wrote only, "If anything happens to me, release immediately." Then I walked out into the street and didn't look back. By afternoon the story began leaking online. Numbers, customs forms, the cleaved circle symbol. Threads pulled into daylight. Victor's empire wavered. The mansion that had been a fortress turned into an exhibit. My painting from the luncheon reappeared on news feeds as a map of escape and accusation. I rented a room in a small coastal town. Each morning I sketched until my hands stopped shaking. My fake artist's life had become real. Colors and glass replaced codes and corridors. I built pieces that broke light into fragments and reassembled it into something like truth. Sometimes I received short encrypted messages from Adrian. Never more than a few words. Safe now, moving, almost done. We were lines on different maps but connected by the same escape velocity. One evening at sunset I walked the pier, my sketchbook under my arm. A man stood at the edge, coat collar up, face turned toward the horizon. For a moment I thought it was a ghost from the mansion. Then he turned, and it was simply someone waiting for a boat. The sky went copper and then violet. The ocean smelled of salt and rust. I realized I no longer felt like a pawn or a ghost. I was a witness who had survived, an artist with her own name. The family that had used me was unraveling. The world beyond the river was mine to claim. The pendant still lay on my bedside table, clasp turned toward the door. I left it that way. Some signals you keep, not because you fear the knock but because you've learned to open the door on your own terms.